Hey guys, tonight we are sliding headfirst into the most glamorous gutter in American history. Hollywood in the 1950s. Not the red carpet version, not the sparkling premieres and the soft focus magazine covers. I mean the real Hollywood, the one that smelled like cigarettes, prescription bottles and broken contracts. The one where the studio system owned you like a very expensive piece of furniture with good cheekbones. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuinely huge thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly your taste is impeccable and slightly alarming. Comments like yours are what keep this channel going, and I mean that. We're also now on Spotify, so if you want to fall asleep to this while commuting, cooking or staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, there's a link in the description. Now dim the lights, pull up the blanket, maybe flip on a fan for that soft white noise, and let yourself sink in. Let's take a second before we go anywhere. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a movie star in 1950s Los Angeles? Not the version they put in the fan magazines, but the real version, the one nobody talked about until it was too late. Did anyone ever ask how you felt when the studio told you to smile through the anxiety, show up to set after 2 hours of sleep, and look like a goddess while running on pills your doctor handed you like breath mints? What did it feel like to live in a mansion that felt like a very elegant prison? To be adored by millions of strangers and understood by almost none of them? To have your name in lights so bright they blinded you to everything falling apart just behind them? Could you survive the contract disputes, the sleeping pills, the studio heads, the publicity machine that ate people alive and called it stardom? And what exactly was in those little white capsules that every director's doctor seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of? Well, congratulations. You have just woken up in Los Angeles. The year is 1953. You're impossibly beautiful, magnificently unhappy, and your bedside table looks like a small pharmacy. Your call time is 6 in the morning. You haven't slept. Good luck. The alarm doesn't ring so much as it ambushes you. 6 in the morning, Los Angeles. The bedroom is enormous and somehow still suffocating, all pale silk drapes and telephone cords stretched across Italian marble floors. Outside the window, the sun is already pressing itself against the hills like it has somewhere to be, which it does, and so do you. You are, by every measurable standard, fabulously successful. The fan mail arrives in canvas sacks, the studio sends orchids every Tuesday, and your face is currently printed on a cereal box somewhere in Ohio. None of this helps at 6 in the morning when your head is pounding, your hands are shaking slightly, and the little orange bottle on the nightstand is already half empty and it's only Wednesday. You sit up slowly, which takes longer than it should, and look around the room. The bedroom is decorated in a style that can best be described as expensive beige. There's a vanity table the size of a small aircraft carrier. There are framed photographs on the walls. Photographs of you, specifically, which were placed there by someone on the studio's design team, and which you've never quite gotten used to. It is, you think, not entirely unlike sleeping inside your own publicity materials. The housekeeper has been in already. You didn't hear her because the housekeeper moves with the particular silence of someone who has been professionally trained to be invisible, which in Hollywood in the 1950s is considered a desirable quality in household staff. There's a tray on the side table with orange juice and toast, and the morning papers, which you won't read yet because the morning papers have a header hopper column, and you've learned through hard experience not to read header hopper before you've fully woken up. This is a rule you made for yourself after the incident with the water glass and the telephone. We don't need to revisit it. The house is quiet in a way that large houses are quiet. Not peacefully quiet, but emptily quiet. The way a theatre sounds when the audience has gone home and the lights are still on. It has 7 bedrooms, a screening, room, a pool that someone comes to maintain on Thursdays, and a guest wing that hasn't had guests in it since the party in February, that went slightly too long and slightly too far, and ended with a studio publicist making several calls at 3 a.m. The rooms you actually use occupy maybe a quarter of the total floor plan. The rest of it is essentially set dressing for a life you're performing rather than living. You reach for the orange bottle. This is not a dramatic gesture in 1950s Hollywood. It is a morning routine with the same mundane inevitability as reaching for a glass of water or a cup of coffee, which you will also do in that order, because the morning pharmaceutical sequence has an established logic. The barbiturate from last night still has its fingers in your thinking, which is why the toast looks faintly unreal, and the orange juice is too bright, and you've picked up the telephone receiver twice already without dialing anyone. This is normal. You are technically functioning. The driver will be here in 45 minutes. You have enough time to shower, finish the studio-approved breakfast, read the parts of the morning paper that are safe, and get yourself together enough to appear, to all outward observers, as someone who slept well and is looking forward to the day. You are very good at this. You've been doing it for years. You're living in a house most people would consider a dream, a life most people would consider extraordinary, in a city that runs entirely on the idea that appearance is substance, and you're 6 a.m. exhausted and faintly shaking and reaching for the orange bottle, and outside the window Los Angeles is golden and relentless and has absolutely no interest in how you actually feel. Welcome to your morning. Try to look like you enjoyed it. In 1950s Hollywood, getting a prescription wasn't so much a medical process as it was a social ritual. You had a doctor, everybody had a doctor, and this doctor had what was gently referred to in polite company as a flexible approach to patient care. He drove a very nice car. His waiting room was full of people with famous faces and nervous hands. You'd sit there flipping through a magazine featuring yourself on the cover and wait for your name to be called, and when it was, you'd walk out 20 minutes later with a small paper bag and the sense that all your problems had temporarily agreed to wait outside. Barbiturates were the currency of the era. Seconal for sleeping, Benzedrine for waking up, and a rotating cast of supporting pharmaceuticals for everything in between. Let's be clear about what barbiturates actually are, since the 1950s tended to discuss them with a vagueness that now seems, in retrospect, somewhat criminally optimistic. They are central nervous system depressants. They slow everything down: heart rate, breathing, the electrical storm of anxious thought. In small doses they produce a pleasant sedation, a smoothing of the jagged edges, a sensation that has been described by various people in various ways, but that essentially amounts to the world becoming temporarily less aggressive. In larger doses, or in combination with alcohol, or after months of escalating tolerance have caused you to keep quietly increasing the amount you take, they can stop your breathing entirely. The studio system understood this in the way that large institutions understand inconvenient facts, selectively, and in ways that prioritized operational continuity. What they needed was for their investment to show up on set, hit the marks, deliver the performance, and appear on the promotional circuit looking radiant and untroubled. The pills helped with this in the short term, and the short term was always the operational horizon. What happened 5 years out was a problem for 5 years from now. The Benzedrine was for the mornings, or the long shooting days, or the nights when there was a premiere after a 14-hour call time, and you needed to be not just present, but incandescent. Amphetamines do a version of this job very effectively. They also, over time, create a specific and unpleasant dependency that expresses itself as irritability, weight loss, heart palpitations, and a quality of alertness that begins to feel less like energy and more like standing too close to something electrical. But you looked thin, which the studio liked, and you were energetic on set, which the director liked, and the pills were prescribed by a licensed physician, which meant the whole arrangement had a satisfying veneer of medical legitimacy. Then there was the cocktail problem, which was less a problem than a pervasive feature of the social landscape. You took the sedative to sleep. You took the stimulant to wake up. You took the sedative to settle the stimulant. You had a drink at the party because the party was work and work required lubrication. You took something to sleep off the drink. Somewhere in this rotation, your nervous system began sending increasingly urgent notes that something had gone structurally wrong with the whole arrangement. But the doctor had something for that too. There were stars who navigated this more carefully, who took less, or stopped sooner, or had the luck and the constitution to step back from the edge before it gave way. And there were stars for whom the pharmaceutical rotation became the scaffolding holding up a performance of functioning that grew harder and harder to maintain. The difference between these two outcomes was not always talent, or intelligence, or moral character. Sometimes it was simply which doctor you'd been assigned. The cabinet sat on the nightstand. Everybody had one. It was the era's most honest self-portrait. Let's talk about your contract. You signed it at 17 or 19 or 21, whichever age the studio liked best, often in a room full of men in suits who spoke very quickly and smiled in a way that didn't quite reach their eyes. The contract was long. You were not encouraged to read all of it. What it meant in practical terms was that the studio owned your name, your image, your hair colour, your weight, your public relationships, your film schedule, your publicity appearances, and in certain circumstances, your opinions on communism. What it didn't own, in theory, was your soul. In practice, this distinction could get a little blurry around year 4. The standard contract at a major Hollywood studio in the 1950s was a 7-year agreement with options, which sounds reasonable until you understand what options meant. The studio had the option to renew. You did not have the option to leave. Every 6 months, the studio would assess its position and decide whether to keep you on. If they kept you, the contract continued. If you decided you no longer wanted to participate, the clock stopped, but the time didn't count. Your suspension period, however long it lasted, was simply added to the end of your original term. You could, in theory, spend the rest of your natural life in a state of contractual obligation to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, which was not exactly what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wrote about liberty. The studios assigned you roles. Not all of them, not always without some discussion, but ultimately, if the studio wanted you in a particular film, you were in that film. If they wanted you to play a femme fatale for the 4th consecutive year, even though you had expressed a clear preference for comedies, you played the femme fatale. If they wanted to loan you to a different studio for a production you found artistically dismal, they loaned you, collected the fee, and explained that this was simply how the business worked, which it was, which is a separate issue from whether it should have been. Your name was a trademarked asset. Your hair colour could be changed by studio decision. Many brunettes became blondes. Many blondes were retained as blondes long past the point of personal preference. Because the publicity material had already established the colour, and the publicity material was an investment, your weight was monitored. The specific number varied by studio and by era and by the particular aesthetic preference of whoever was running the production, but the monitoring was consistent. You were a physical product, and physical products require quality control. This was not said in those words. It was understood. What the system provided in return was genuine and not nothing. Money, visibility, a career infrastructure that would have taken decades to assemble independently, access to directors and cinematographers and costume designers who were the best in the world at what they did. For every star who was crushed by the machine, there were others who worked it skillfully, who understood the terms well enough to extract what they needed while protecting what mattered. The system was not purely predatory. It was something more complicated, a transaction with severely unequal terms conducted in an atmosphere of almost total asymmetrical information. But the information gap was the thing. You didn't know what you were signing. You didn't know what it would feel like 5 years in to be told, by people who owned your name in a legal sense, that the role they'd selected for you was not negotiable. You didn't know that the contract you'd signed in a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon would shape the next decade of your life in ways that your 20-year-old self was not equipped to predict. Nobody told you. That was arguably the whole design. The makeup department at a major studio in the 1950s was part assembly line, part operating theatre, and part very early morning support group. You arrived before dawn, which felt criminal, sat down in a chair bolted to the floor in front of a mirror lined with light bulbs, and for the next 2 hours you ceased to exist as a person and became a project. The makeup artists were extraordinary, genuinely talented, warm, and deeply skilled in the art of making a person who hadn't slept look like someone who had never experienced a moment of fatigue in their lives. They would chat with you about nothing in particular, their brushes moving across your face in small expert strokes, and you would watch yourself disappear in the mirror, replaced by something luminous and fictional and entirely sellable. The foundation came first. In the 1950s, the standard film makeup foundation was heavy enough to be detectable from a moderate distance by its smell alone, a combination of grease paint and something mineral that settled into the skin like theatrical plaster. It covered everything: shadows, blemishes, the particular grey quality of a complexion that has been sleeping 4 hours a night for several weeks. Under the controlled heat of the studio lights, which ran at a temperature that could generously be described as volcanic, the foundation would begin to shift by mid-morning, which is why the makeup artists were always nearby, present on set with their brushes and their powders, and their patient, unhurried energy, ready to restore the fiction between takes. The eyes were the longest part. The studio style of the era required precision, specific cat-eye liner applied with a brush so fine it was essentially a single hair attached to a wooden stick, eyebrows reshaped according to the studio's current aesthetic preference, which changed every few years with the inexorable logic of fashion, and which you personally had no vote on. If the studio preferred thin-arched brows, you had thin-arched brows. If the style shifted to something fuller, they shifted. Your actual face was a starting position, a rough draft that the department revised each morning according to requirements. Hair and makeup were separate operations happening simultaneously on different parts of you, which created the slightly surreal sensation of being worked on from multiple directions by people who were fully awake at 5 a.m. in a way that seemed not entirely human. The hairdressers had their own territory, their own tools, their own complex relationship with a specific style that the studio had determined was most appropriate for your current image. The style had a name, they all had names, and it was reproduced with absolute consistency from day to day, because continuity was a technical requirement, and also because any variation would appear on camera as a mistake. The costume came after. You stood while the wardrobe department fitted, adjusted, pinned, and discussed. The silhouettes of the era required specific understructure, foundation garments with engineering ambitions that made sitting down a negotiated activity. The costumes themselves were often beautiful in a way that existed primarily in 2 dimensions, optimized for how they photographed rather than how they felt. Boning, wiring, internal architecture. You breathed in a calibrated way and stood very straight and looked at your reflection in the 3-panelled mirror and saw the character looking back at you. By the time all of this was complete, you had been in the studio for 2 hours and the workday technically hadn't started yet. You were already tired. You were also, in a way you could not achieve by any other means, entirely transformed. The anxious, orange bottle-reaching, 2-big-house-inhabiting person of 6 in the morning replaced by something made of light and deliberate fiction. The chair was waiting again tomorrow at 5:30. In the meantime, you had a film to make. The drive from your home in Bel Air or Brentwood or Laurel Canyon to the studio lot was not a commute so much as a performance. You didn't drive yourself. Stars didn't drive. Or rather, Stars weren't supposed to be seen driving themselves, because seeing a goddess behind the wheel of a Buick station wagon has a tendency to complicate the mythology. So there was a driver, a very discreet driver who had presumably signed something. The car was almost always black, almost always polished to a reflective shine, and you sat in the back in your sunglasses feeling the particular loneliness of being recognized everywhere you went and known by almost no one. Los Angeles in the 1950s was still, in certain lights and at certain hours, an extraordinarily beautiful city. The drive through the hills in the early morning before the heat settled and before the traffic thickened into its midday density had a quality of almost painful clarity. The eucalyptus trees along the road, the light coming sideways through the canyons, the way the city spread out below toward the Pacific in a kind of indifferent splendor. You saw this every morning from the back of the car, and you noticed it the way you notice things you are moving through too quickly to actually experience. Being recognized was a specific texture that was very difficult to explain to people who hadn't lived inside it. It wasn't just being looked at. Everyone in a public space is occasionally looked at. It was the particular quality of the looking, the slight shift in a stranger's posture, the way their eyes fixed on your face for a beat too long before they were sure, and then the moment they were sure, and then whatever came after that. Sometimes it was admiration, warm and straightforward. Sometimes it was something more complicated, a kind of acquisitive attention, as if by looking long enough they could take something. Sometimes it was people who simply couldn't help themselves, who said your name out loud before they'd consciously decided to, who approached the car at a stoplight and placed their hand on the glass. The sunglasses helped and didn't help. They were a social convention rather than a practical solution. This style of the era required frames that covered approximately a third of the face, which created partial obscurity, while simultaneously being a costume element so specific to fame that wearing them often advertised the very thing they were meant to conceal. A woman in large dark sunglasses in the back of a black car was not invisible. She was a specific type of image, culturally established, immediately legible. You wore them anyway because the alternative was worse. The lot appeared after 20 minutes or 40 minutes depending on traffic, a series of enormous soundstage buildings behind a guarded gate that your car moved through with a wave from the security man who'd been there since before your first picture and would in all likelihood be there after your last. The lot was a self-contained world, streets, buildings, entire exterior sets of cities that didn't exist, a commissary, a barber shop, offices where your contract was filed in a drawer. On the lot, you were simultaneously the most important person present and entirely subject to the machine that the lot was built to run. The car stopped. The driver opened the door. You put your feet on the ground in shoes that were not ideal for the surface, and the sunglasses caught the early light, and someone near the soundstage looked up and you straightened and became, again, what the situation required. This was the commute. Every single morning. It was yours. The studio set at 6:30 in the morning had the energy of a military operation that had been running for several days too long. Cables snaked across the floor, lights blazed down from above at an intensity that made the sun seem understated, and somewhere in the middle of all this, a director with a viewfinder around his neck was telling someone to move a lamp 3 inches to the left. You arrived already fully transformed by makeup and wardrobe, already wearing the face and body of the character, already performing a version of yourself that was smoother and more manageable than the real one, and you would do this for the next 12 to 15 hours, hitting your marks, remembering your lines and looking effortlessly radiant under conditions that would have made a reasonable person weep. The marks were literal, strips of tape on the floor in specific positions that corresponded to where the lighting rigs and camera angles had been calibrated. You stood on your mark. You delivered your line. If you were slightly off your mark, half a foot, sometimes less, the shot didn't work and you did it again. On a difficult scene, On a complicated day, you might do a single moment 30 or 40 times, each time producing the emotional content from whatever interior reserve you were drawing from, each time landing on the tape. The takes that were slightly off in technical terms were cut. The takes that were technically perfect, but felt dead in some ineffable way, were also cut. The takes that were both technically precise and emotionally alive were what you were there to produce, and there was no formula for how to do that reliably, which was either the art of acting or the cruelty of the profession, depending on how the day was going. The lights were the physical fact that governed everything. They were hot, genuinely, functionally, profoundly hot, and they were bright in a way that had no natural equivalent. After a few hours under studio lights, the world beyond the set seemed dim and slightly unreal by comparison, which was perhaps fitting since the world beyond the set was also where you lived. The makeup artists moved in and out of frame between takes, touching up, adjusting, maintaining the fiction of your face through the rising temperature of the afternoon. You sweated in a specific controlled way that required attention. The director was the central creative authority on set, and also, depending on the director, either your greatest collaborator or a source of specific daily dread. The range was wide. Some directors of the era treated their actors with enormous respect, understood the vulnerability involved in the work, created space for something real to happen, protected the performance from the logistics. Others treated the actors as technical elements to be positioned and triggered. Neither approach produced reliably better films, which is one of the more demoralizing facts about the medium. By hour 10, something had usually shifted. The energy of the morning, the caffeine, the benzodrine, the professional adrenaline of beginning had used itself up, and what remained was a tiredness that was both physical and cognitive, a state in which emotional recall was harder to access, and physical precision was more difficult to maintain. This was the part of the day when the mistakes happened, when someone's concentration slipped and a prop was in the wrong hand, when a line was misread for the third consecutive take, when the director's voice developed an edge that you tried not to let affect the work and inevitably did. Rap was called eventually. It was always later than the call sheet said. You removed the character in reverse, costume, then hair, then makeup, the face re-emerging from the plaster, in the same order it had been applied that morning. The driver was waiting. You did it again tomorrow. It was a job. Some days it was also something more than that. There was a phrase in Hollywood that functioned less as a metaphor and more as a geography lesson. Everyone knew where the casting couch was, in the sense that everyone understood the system it represented, the unspoken economy of access, the price of the screen test, the door that opened for some people and stayed firmly shut for others, and the men with the power to open it who understood their leverage with a clarity that never showed up in the trade papers. No one wrote about it directly. Fan magazines published breathless profiles of studio executives as visionary artists, benevolent patrons of American dreams, men who simply had an eye for talent. The talent, meanwhile, knew differently. The system was old. It predated the sound era, predated the studio system in its consolidated 1950s form, predated most of the institutions that surrounded it. It had been a feature of the entertainment industry since there was an entertainment industry, which did not make it less damaging and did not make it more acceptable, but which did mean that by the 1950s it had been fully absorbed into the operational infrastructure of the business, not as an aberration or a scandal, but as a mechanism, a well understood if unacknowledged part of how certain careers began. What it meant in practical terms was this. There were rooms where decisions were made about who would be seen on camera and who would not. Those rooms were controlled by men. The women, and it was primarily, though not exclusively, women who wanted access to those decisions were navigating a system that treated their bodies as a relevant variable in the casting calculus. Some refused entirely, which sometimes meant their careers went more slowly, or not at all. Some complied under conditions of varying coercion, from the genuinely voluntary to the genuinely coercive, with a full range of complicated and ambiguous terrain in between. Some found mentors and protectors, relationships that were also not uncomplicated, who provided access without explicit transaction. Most navigated by instinct and information, passed informally between women who understood the landscape. The silence around it was structural. You could not report it because reporting it required reporting it to someone, and the someones with the authority to do anything were the same people with the power being discussed. You could not discuss it publicly, because the publicity machine would reframe the discussion as a crisis of your own character. You could not leave the industry because you were under contract and leaving was not an option. You existed in a system that had defined the terms of the conversation in such a way that the conversation could not reach the thing it needed to name. Some of the most famous women of the era spoke about this in later decades, in interviews conducted after the system that had controlled them had partially dissolved. They spoke carefully and specifically, and with a clarity that was, depending on your age when you read it, either shocking or entirely expected. Marilyn Monroe, among others, was characteristically direct. She described being steered through rooms and introductions, the way access and opportunity were dispensed in a context that was never explicitly stated, but universally understood. What is perhaps the most historically notable thing about the casting couch era is not that it existed. Powerful people exploiting the powerless is not a novel historical development, but that it was so entirely incorporated into the cultural mythology of Hollywood, as something glamorous, as a secret of the industry, as one of the titillating backstage truths about how magic was made. The couch became a dark joke, a winking shorthand. The joke protected the people doing the harm and invited the people being harmed to regard their experience as part of the story, rather than as what it was. It wasn't glamorous, it was a system. Systems can be changed. This one eventually was, though not quickly and not completely, and not without enormous cost to an enormous number of people who deserved better from the dream they'd come to pursue. Your publicist was, in a very real sense, the author of your life. Not your actual life. Your life was whatever it needed to be on any given Tuesday, but the life that appeared in Photoplay magazine, on the radio, in the carefully staged photographs of you watering your garden in a silk blouse. This life was constructed with the same deliberate attention that went into set design, because it was set design, a fictional domestic space you were required to inhabit convincingly at all times. You had approved opinions on things, you had a preferred colour and a favourite childhood memory, and a dog whose name had been chosen for maximum wholesomeness. You were, in the publicity sense, a very consistent and uncomplicated person who slept well and had no complicated feelings about anything. The studio publicity departments of the 1950s were remarkable institutions, staffed by people of genuine ingenuity who were engaged in a form of narrative construction that has not been sufficiently recognised as the art form it was. They invented biographies, they softened histories, they relocated childhoods to more photogenic states and removed fathers who had been inconveniently problematic and added siblings who were usefully wholesome. They decided what you'd escaped from, what you yearned toward, and what you'd learned along the way, and they packaged this into a story that was legible and appealing, and almost entirely fictional, and entirely you, in the sense that it bore your name and your face and was being distributed to 40 million people a month. The fan mail was real. This is worth remembering in the midst of all the machinery. The people who wrote to you were genuinely connected to something, even if the thing they were connected to was a construction. They had watched you on the screen in their local theatre on a Friday night and felt something, some version of recognition or aspiration or comfort. and they had sat down and written it out in longhand on whatever paper was available, and sent it to an address in Culver City where it arrived in canvas sacks and was processed by studio staff who sent back an 8x10 glossy and a form letter that was signed not by you, but by someone whose job was to be your signature. The emotion was real. The transaction was entirely managed. You gave interviews. The interviews were conducted in studio-approved settings, a bungalow on the lot, a preferred restaurant, your own living room which had been prepared by someone from the studio in advance of the journalist's arrival. The questions were, in many cases, known beforehand. The answers were practiced. There were topics you didn't discuss: the contract dispute, the previous relationship, the weeks you'd spent in the facility in Palm Springs that everyone was calling a rest, the pharmaceutical situation, the actual state of your actual feelings about anything of substance. These were managed not through explicit prohibition in most cases, but through the social architecture of the interview itself, the publicist present in the room, the implicit understanding between journalist and subject about what the story was and what it was not. The photographs were the most precisely managed element of all. Every image released of you had been selected from a session, reviewed, approved, and in many cases retouched before it appeared anywhere. The selection process was not casual. Contact sheets were reviewed by studio personnel, by your publicist, sometimes by you, with images eliminated for the specific quality of anxiousness in the eyes, or the way the light had caught something in your face that the fiction couldn't accommodate. The approved images went into the world and became the record. The rejected ones disappeared into archive boxes or were destroyed. The result, accumulated over years of interviews and photographs and approved biographies and fan magazine profiles, was a person. A specific, legible, appealing, entirely constructed person who shared your face and your name, and who was, in many ways, more real to the public than you were. You had to be consistent with her. That was the ongoing work, being consistent with the person they'd built from you, every day, in every public context, for as long as the contract required. It was exhausting in a way that was genuinely difficult to explain, because it looked from the outside like nothing, like simply being yourself, which everyone else had to do for free. Every Monday morning at certain major studios, certain female stars were weighed. This is not a rumour or an exaggeration. It was policy, documented, matter of fact, treated with the same casual bureaucratic indifference as submitting a timesheet. If you were over the number on the contract and the number was always very low, always lower than a reasonable person would consider a number, there were consequences. The consequences were delivered calmly, professionally, and in the tone of people doing you a favour. You might be assigned a diet. You might find that your scenes were suddenly being rewritten to include longer shots. You might notice that the wardrobe department had been very quietly restructured. You might also find that a small pill had been helpfully added to the morning pharmaceutical lineup, a little amphetamine to smooth things along, studio compliments. The number in the contract was not derived from any medical reasoning. It was not a weight at which you were healthiest, or strongest, or most cognitively functional, or most capable of surviving a 15-hour shooting day on 4 hours of sleep with a full pharmaceutical schedule. It was a number at which the camera, operating through specific lenses at specific distances, produced an image consistent with the studio's current aesthetic requirements for female bodies. This is a slightly different set of criteria, it turns out. Judy Garland was famously, horrifyingly subjected to this system from childhood. MGM put her on amphetamines and barbiturates before she was 20. The pills to keep her thin and energetic during the day, the other pills to bring her down enough to sleep at night. She described it later, in various forms, as a process of being wound up and unwound by institutional machinery that had no conception of her as a person and an extremely precise conception of her as an asset. She was one of the most talented performers of the 20th century, and she spent most of her professional life being weighed on Mondays and medicated accordingly. This is a fact. It should be disturbing. It remains disturbing. The diet culture of the studio system was specific and aggressive. Some stars were put on 500-calorie-a-day regimens that would, in contemporary medical terms, be classified as starvation. Some were told to eat nothing after noon. Some were given meal plans so restrictive and so disconnected from actual nutritional science that maintaining them required the kind of pharmaceutical assistance the studio was also providing, in a circular logic that was either elegant or horrifying, depending on which side of the prescription pad you were on. You were thin because of the pills. You needed the pills because of the diet. The diet was required because of the contract. The contract was the point. What made this particularly disorienting was the social context in which it occurred. You were surrounded at all times by other people operating under similar constraints, which made the constraints feel normal. Everyone was on something. Everyone was being weighed somewhere by someone. The collective abnormality of the environment made individual abnormality invisible. If you expressed distress about the situation, if you said in some private setting that the diet was making you feel unwell, or that the pills were creating problems you couldn't manage, the response was generally sympathetic and unhelpful. Sympathetic because the person you were speaking to had probably experienced something similar. Unhelpful because there was no mechanism for addressing the underlying structural fact, which was that the institution you worked for had decided your body was a technical problem it had the right to solve. The women who left behind accounts of this, in memoirs, in interviews, in the occasional moment of startling candour that slipped past the publicist, describe a specific kind of dissociation from their own physical experience. Your body was not entirely yours. It was subject to external review, external management, external modification. The pills were given to you, the diets were given to you, the weigh-ins were administered. The relationship between you and your own physical experience was mediated constantly by institutional interest. This is not ancient history. It was last Tuesday in Hollywood terms. The women it happened to were real people with names, you know. Let us say, for the sake of argument, that one day you read your contract, all of it, including the small print at the bottom of page 17. And let's say that on this day you walked into an office and said, in a polite but firm voice, that you did not want to make this film, or that you felt the script was beneath what you'd agreed to, or that you needed 2 weeks off because your nervous system had been sending you increasingly urgent telegrams, and you thought you should probably respond. What happened next depended heavily on which studio, which executive, and which year, but the range of possible outcomes ran from a suspension, meaning no pay, no work, but also no escape, since the suspension time was added to your contract, to a media campaign so skillfully executed that by the time it was over, the general public had somehow formed the impression that you were difficult. The word difficult was the industry's most efficiently deployed weapon. It is a word that contains almost no information. Difficult in what sense? Difficult compared to whom? Difficult under what circumstances and for what reasons? But that functions in a professional context as a devastating piece of shorthand. A difficult actor was an unreliable asset. An unreliable asset was a financial risk. A financial risk was someone whose future projects would be harder to greenlight, whose insurance would be more expensive, whose name on a contract would prompt careful private conversations among the men at the lunch tables. You could be made difficult by a single well-placed comment in the right ear. You could be made difficult by a publicist who was no longer fully on your side, or a director who filed a report, or a studio executive who decided for reasons that were sometimes economic and sometimes personal and sometimes indistinguishable, that you needed to be repositioned. The formal suspension was the blunt instrument. If you refused a role, The studio suspended you without pay and added the suspension time to your contract. This was legal. It was in the document you had signed. It meant that your already unequal negotiating position became worse, because you were now not earning money while the clock was extended, and the studio was still earning money from your previous work, and the leverage differential continued to compound. Olivia de Havilland challenged this practice directly in the late 1940s, taking Warner Brothers to court in a case that established that suspension time could not legally be added to a contract term, a ruling that was genuinely significant, and that the studios absorbed with the gracious acceptance of institutions that have other mechanisms they can use instead. What happened in practice after de Havilland was more subtle and more difficult to address legally. The studio still controlled your schedule, your role selection, your publicity apparatus, and your professional relationships. They could assign you a film you didn't want to make without formally punishing you for refusing, simply by making it very clear that refusing was not a viable option. They could deprioritize your projects. They could be slow to respond to requests for script approval. They could loan you to a smaller studio at a rate that reflected the current state of your relationship with management. The stars who successfully pushed back, and some did, tended to have specific advantages: an unusually skilled lawyer, an unusually large box office profile that made them genuinely irreplaceable in the short term, or the willingness to absorb significant short-term damage in pursuit of better long-term terms. Betty Davis fought Warner's so consistently and so effectively that she fundamentally altered the nature of her contract over time. She described it as a decade of warfare conducted at close range in expensive clothes. She was not wrong, and she won more than most. Most didn't have her resources or her temperament. Most signed what they were given, showed up when they were called, and filed the bad feelings in the internal drawer where all the bad feelings went and did the job. The job continued. In the early 1950s, something happened to Hollywood that the old guard found deeply bewildering and vaguely threatening. A group of young actors from New York showed up with opinions about their craft. They had studied at the Actors Studio with Lee Strasberg. They talked about motivation and emotional memory and sense recall. They sometimes refused to come out of character between takes, which made lunch complicated. They asked questions that directors had not previously been required to answer. Where the old system produced technically accomplished studio-polished performers who could hit a mark and deliver a line in 17 takes, these new arrivals seemed to be doing something else entirely, something messier, louder, more unsettling, and occasionally more electric than anything anyone had seen before. The method, in its Strasberg form, asked actors to access genuine emotional experience rather than technical simulation. If the scene required grief, the actor was encouraged to locate real grief, some actual loss from their actual life, and bring it into the scene. If the scene required fear, they found real fear. The process was supposed to produce authenticity, a quality that the camera, which sees everything, would register in ways that technical performance could not replicate. In theory, this was compelling. In practice, it occasionally produced Marlon Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire, which was unlike anything that had previously appeared on a Hollywood screen, and which made the argument for the approach rather decisively. The establishment's discomfort was understandable and not entirely unreasonable. The old system ran on technical precision and institutional compliance. You showed up, you knew your lines, you hit your marks, you delivered on command. The studio could plan around this, you could schedule it. The method introduced variables, actors who needed time to prepare, who might not be ready on schedule, who had feelings about the work that they expressed to the director in ways that delayed production. Brando famously arrived on sets having not learned his lines, relying on cue cards in some cases, which enraged directors who considered it unprofessional and fascinated cinematographers who found the results startlingly real. Montgomery Clift was perhaps the most technically gifted of the method generation, a performer of extraordinary precision who had internalized the approach so thoroughly that the internal and external work were indistinguishable. He was also, by most accounts, in significant personal distress throughout much of his career, a fact that was both relevant to the work and irrelevant to the schedule, which didn't stop for distress. His car accident in 1956, which restructured his face and his career simultaneously, is one of the more visibly tragic moments of the era, a point at which the cost of what the industry required from certain people became briefly impossible to avoid seeing. Marilyn Monroe studied at the Actors Studio under Strasberg and took the approach seriously, in ways that her comedic public image tended to obscure. Her performance in Bus Stop is a demonstration of what she was capable of when the approach worked. Her difficulties on sets, the lateness, the inability to deliver a line on command, the requirement for dozens of takes, were widely reported as unprofessionalism and personal dysfunction, and were certainly sometimes those things, but were also sometimes the result of trying to do something genuine in an environment that was structured around the simulacrum. The tension between the two approaches, technical versus internal, institutional versus personal, runs through the 1950s in Hollywood like a fault line. It was, in some sense, an argument about what films were supposed to do and what actors were supposed to be. The method people said, "We are here to tell the truth about human experience." The studio said, "You're here at 6:30 and the camera is rolling at 7. Both things were simultaneously true. That was the problem. In 1950s Hollywood, two women held a specific kind of power that no studio executive, no director, and no contract lawyer could fully replicate. The power to put your name in print in a way that you could not control. Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons were gossip columnists whose combined readership numbered in the tens of millions, which meant that what they wrote about you on a Wednesday morning was being read by the population of several medium-sized countries by Thursday afternoon. They were not journalists in any technical sense. They were, more accurately, forces of nature with typewriters and deeply specific vendettas, and they had to be handled with the kind of careful, exhausting diplomacy normally reserved for international negotiations. Luella Parsons had been in the business since the silent era. By the 1950s, she was a Hearst columnist of enormous syndication and a woman who had spent decades accumulating sources, favours, debts, and a Rolodex that contained the private number of almost everyone who mattered in Hollywood. She was famous for her exclusives, information obtained through a network of sources that functioned less like journalism and more like an intelligence operation, one where everyone was simultaneously a potential asset and a potential target. Getting a piece of news to Luella first, before she found it another way, was considered a form of tribute that kept the relationship functional. Failing to do this had consequences. Hedda Hopper came from a different angle. An actress herself in the silent era who had not achieved the stardom she'd sought, she came to the column with the specific perspective of someone who'd been inside the system and understood exactly where the pressure points were. She wore hats of legendary architectural ambition. This was her public image. The hats, though the hats were in some ways the least interesting thing about her, and she wielded her column with a combination of genuine conservatism, deep personal loyalties, and the occasional strategic cruelty of someone who had found the one area in which she was more powerful than the people who had passed over her earlier. What both women had, in different registers, was the ability to reframe a story. A relationship ended. Luella's version of why it ended became the operative account. A film underperformed. Hedda's interpretation of who was responsible shaped how the industry discussed it. A star was seen somewhere they shouldn't have been, or with someone they shouldn't have been with, or behaving in a way that didn't match the approved biography, The columnists were the mechanism by which this information either became news or didn't, depending on the current state of their relationship with the person involved. You cultivated them. Everyone cultivated them. The cultivation took the form of exclusive tips, preferential access, attendance at their parties, the occasional gift that fell in the category of professional courtesy, and the ongoing management of your behaviour in ways designed to reduce the amount of information they might find it useful to report. You called them back. You sent flowers. You smiled in photographs. You did not, under any circumstances, give them a reason to be your enemy, because having Hedda Hopper as your enemy in the early 1950s was something that showed up in your career statistics in ways that were difficult to explain as coincidence. The power they held was real, and it was also deeply strange. When you stopped to look at it, two women in an industry that gave women almost no formal authority, wielding enormous informal authority, precisely because the industry had given them access to its secrets and no official mechanism to contain them. They were the system's pressure valve and its surveillance apparatus simultaneously. They kept everyone honest in the sense of keeping everyone performing honesty convincingly, which is a different thing but was, in this context, what was required. You called them on their birthdays, both of them, every year. A Hollywood premiere in the 1950s was many things: a marketing event, a tribal gathering, a carefully orchestrated piece of theatre in which everyone present was simultaneously audience and performer. You arrived in the limousine. You stepped onto the red carpet. The flashbulbs went off with a sound like applause, which was appropriate because this was, in every important sense, a performance. You smiled the smile, the particular smile, practiced, warm but not too warm, accessible but not available, and you moved along the line of photographers with the measured grace of someone who had done this many times before and intended to do it many times again. The dress had been chosen weeks ago. The jewellery was borrowed. The smile was yours, probably, though you'd been wearing it so long it was hard to remember anymore. The red carpet was a physical space, but also a very specific social contract. The photographers needed images. The studio needed coverage. You needed the coverage to be the right kind, visible but not overexposed, glamorous but not remote, aspirational but not alienating. You moved at a specific pace, slow enough for the shots, fast enough to avoid the appearance of desperation for them. There were photographers you recognized and acknowledged, which was important because the photographers who felt acknowledged produced better images, and the photographers who felt ignored found other angles. All of this was understood without being spoken, learned through experience in the way that complex social protocols are always learned, by doing it wrong and watching what happened. The theatre itself, after the red carpet, was an enormous auditorium filled with people who were also performing. Stars in the audience behaved for each other the way they behaved for cameras, visible, composed, strategically placed. The seating arrangement was not accidental. Publicists and studio executives had worked on it the way generals work on a battlefield map. Who sat next to whom communicated things. Who arrived together communicated things. Who left early and with whom also communicated things, though at that point the photographers were gone and the communication was to the other people in the room, which was a different but not less important audience. The film screened. You watched yourself on a screen 40 feet high, in a room full of your peers, and tried to experience this as a neutral observer rather than as a person who knew exactly what had happened on the day that scene was filmed, and what the makeup artist had been covering, and how many takes it had taken to get the line right, and what you'd taken that morning to get through the day. This was, in practice, impossible. What you actually experienced was closer to the sensation of reading your diary aloud at a professional conference. Technically accurate, but disorienting in ways that had nothing to do with the quality of the work. After the screening, there was a party. The party was also work. You move through it in a specific pattern, greeting the director, acknowledging the producer, being visible with the right people at the right moments for the photographers who'd been admitted to the party specifically to document your visibility with the right people. The drinks were present and you were careful with them, or you were less careful, depending on the evening and the pharmaceutical landscape and how the day had gone overall. You ate nothing because there was nothing to eat at a Hollywood party that was both edible and photographically appropriate. At some point the evening ended. The car collected you. The dress came off. The jewellery went back to wherever borrowed jewellery goes. The face came off in stages, foundation first, the character dissolving in the bathroom mirror until what was left was only you, which after an evening of being publicly yourself in a constructed sense felt startlingly quiet and strangely personal. The coverage ran in the morning papers. The photographs were good. The smile looked completely genuine. The house was always too big. This was a feature, not a design flaw. A too big house was the correct house for a major star of the 1950s, because a too big house communicated the right things to the right people, and communicating the right things was the work of every waking hour. But the house being too big meant that when the door closed and the car drove away, and the publicist stopped calling, and the day was finally mercifully over, you were left alone in a large, expensive, well-appointed space that felt less like a home and more like a very convincing stage set for someone else's idea of your life. The rooms were decorated by people with good taste and no particular investment in you as a person. The furniture was elegant and slightly impersonal in the way that hotel furniture is impersonal, designed to accommodate an occupant rather than to express one. There were fresh flowers on Tuesdays, which the housekeeper arranged in the 2 vases in the entry hall and the one on the living room table, and by Thursday they were beginning to fade at the edges, and by Sunday they were gone, and the space where they'd been was empty until Tuesday again. You noticed this cycle with a regularity that was out of proportion to its importance, which told you something about the state of your attention. The telephone rang. This was either good or bad, depending entirely on who was calling, which you never knew until you answered it, which created a specific low-level anxiety around the telephone that you had tried explaining to the studio psychiatrist with limited success. Your publicist called with information that required immediate action, or at least the performance of immediate action. Your director called with concerns about tomorrow's schedule that were either legitimate or the opening move in a larger negotiation. Your mother called from Ohio or Cleveland or wherever the approved biography had placed your origins, and you spoke to her in the voice you used for family calls, which was slightly different from the voice you used for everything else, quieter and less managed. Eating alone in the big house was an activity you had developed an elaborate relationship with. The housekeeper prepared meals on a schedule. The meals were appropriate in the caloric sense, calibrated to the Monday weigh-in, which was always in the background of every meal as a kind of silent moderating presence. You sat at a table that was designed for 8, and ate something that was good and tasted like nothing in particular because you had been up since 5 in the morning, and your appetite had long since been replaced by pharmaceutical management of what your body was supposed to want. The sleeping was the worst part, in the specific sense that the sleeping was when the structure fell away entirely. The days had shape, call time, set, makeup, the schedule, the driver, the ritual sequence of demands and performances that organised the hours. The nights had no shape. You lay in the too big bedroom in the too big house, and the barbiturate from the orange bottle worked on the edges of consciousness without quite solving the underlying problem, which was a quality of alertness that had no legitimate object at 11:30 at night in a room with no one else in it. The mornings came, the driver came, the make-up chair and the marks and the lights and the director. And then the house again, in the evening, with the fading flowers and the telephone and the prescription that kept the edge off the silence. You lived there for years. Some of it was fine, Some of it was genuinely beautiful. The light in the hills in the late afternoon was extraordinary. You noticed it when you could. Some of the most photographed romances in 1950s, Hollywood were also among the most carefully constructed. Not all of them, certainly, and not in the same way. But the studio machinery had a long-standing interest in the romantic lives of its stars that went significantly beyond sentimentality. A well-chosen relationship could generate coverage, soften a difficult public image, redirect uncomfortable questions, and generally contribute to the overall project of keeping a valuable asset looking appealing and uncomplicated. You might be introduced to your future spouse at a studio lunch. You might find that your publicist had already worked out a release schedule for the relationship before the second date. You might discover at some point that the man or woman you were photographed with every Tuesday evening had very similar contractual incentives to be there. The publicity marriage, which is the polite term, and the polite term is generous, served multiple functions. For male stars whose private lives were directed toward men, at a time when this was criminally prosecutable in most American states, a suitable female companion was an operational necessity rather than a romantic choice. For female stars whose public image required the softening effect of domesticity, the implication of a real life beyond the screen, a home, a relationship, a normal human romantic experience, a well-chosen husband served the same function that the dog and the garden and the approved favourite colour served in the fan magazine profile. He was set dressing. He was ideally a man who understood this and whose own reasons for the arrangement were compatible with yours. Rock Hudson's management of this situation was perhaps the most extensively documented example. In retrospect, though the extent of the management was not publicly known during his lifetime, his studio, Universal, understood his situation and managed it with the systematic efficiency they brought to all operational problems. He was introduced to his future wife, Phyllis Gates, through his agent, Henry Wilson, in circumstances that have been interpreted differently by different participants. The marriage lasted 3 years. The coverage it generated was enormous and positive. The story it told was entirely false and entirely functional, and kept a man's career intact at a time when its exposure would have destroyed it. This is not a comfortable thing to describe. It's also what happened. For female stars, the arranged dimension of studio-era marriages sometimes operated differently, though not more kindly. You might be paired with a man who was genuinely compatible, and for whom the relationship developed into something real and sustaining over time. This happened. You might be paired with a man who was a good professional ally and a poor domestic partner. You might be paired with a man who understood the transactional nature of the arrangement more explicitly than you did when you signed on to it, which created a specific and unpleasant imbalance. You might, on the other hand, be in a genuine relationship that the studio then managed, packaged, and released on a publicity schedule that transformed something personal into something institutional, which had its own complicated effects. The domestic photographs ran in the magazines. The approved home, the approved relationship, the approved evidence of normalcy. You smiled in them, next to him, in front of whatever backdrop the photographer had been given access to, and the people in Ohio and Cleveland and everywhere else read about your happiness with a warmth that was entirely genuine and directed at something that was almost entirely constructed. Some of the marriages endured. Some produced genuine affection. Some produced children who grew up with complicated relationships to the word home. Most eventually ended in divorces that were also, in their management and their timing, studio operations, released when the coverage benefit of the dissolution exceeded the coverage benefit of the continuation. You went to the wedding. You wore white. You smiled the smile. In polite circles, in trade papers, in the language of studio press agents, the word they used was not alcoholism. The words they used were exhaustion, overwork, a difficult period, taking time to rest, and occasionally, in the most oblique cases, a health matter of a private nature. The drinks at the party were never the story, even when they clearly were. Everyone drank in 1950s Hollywood, at lunch, at dinner, at the Thursday junket that was technically a professional obligation, at the Sunday afternoon party that was technically leisure. Alcohol was not a problem, it was the atmosphere. It was what the air in certain rooms was made of. The drinking culture of mid-century Hollywood was not distinctive to Hollywood. Mid-century America drank comprehensively and enthusiastically across most social strata and professional contexts. But Hollywood's drinking had specific features that the general culture's drinking did not. It took place in a context of chronic stress, pharmaceutical mixing, professional insecurity, and a social architecture that made the drink in your hand a participation signal, a flag indicating that you were present and functioning and in command of yourself. Not drinking at a Hollywood party in 1954 was itself a statement, and not a neutral one. It suggested recovery, or illness, or the kind of personal struggle that was supposed to remain invisible. The interaction between alcohol and barbiturates was known to medicine if not widely discussed in social settings. Both are central nervous system depressants, both slow breathing, both reduce the threshold for respiratory failure. Taken separately in managed doses, each is survivable. Taken together, particularly in escalating doses, the combination could kill you in your sleep in a way that was indistinguishable from natural causes, and was not always distinguished from natural causes in the official records, particularly when the person who had died was famous, and the studio's insurance situation was complicated. You drank at the parties because the parties were work and the drinking made the work easier. You drank at home because home was quiet in the specific way that made quiet unbearable after 10 o'clock at night. You drank at lunch sometimes, which was normal, which everyone did, which is what you told yourself when you noticed that the lunch drinking had moved earlier in the meal and was occasionally the meal. The studio doctor monitored the pharmaceutical situation, but the drinking wasn't his department. The publicist managed the public dimension, but the drinking at home wasn't her department. The contract manager was concerned with performance, but the drinking that was making performance inconsistent was structurally someone else's problem until it wasn't. The taxonomy of Hollywood drinking in the era is instructive. Social drinking, which was fine, professional drinking, which was required, stress drinking, which was understandable, problem drinking, which didn't exist technically, because the word problem implied a diagnosis, and a diagnosis implied treatment, and treatment implied acknowledgement that something was wrong, and acknowledging that something was wrong with a valuable asset was not something the studio's interest structure encouraged. What eventually happened, in case after case, was that the something wrong became impossible to not acknowledge, at which point the language shifted to exhaustion and overwork and a health matter of a private nature, and the star was sent somewhere, and the studio issued a statement, and the fan magazines ran sympathetic coverage, and sometimes the person came back and sometimes they didn't. The drinks at the party continued to circulate. The waiter appeared regularly. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and expensive perfume, and something under both of those things that was harder to name. Every major studio had, in some official or semi-official capacity, a physician whose primary qualification appears to have been an extraordinarily flexible interpretation of the Hippocratic Oath. This was the person you called when you couldn't sleep, or couldn't wake up, or couldn't get through the dinner scene without your hand shaking, or needed something to get you through the premiere, or needed something to bring you down after the premiere, or simply needed someone with a medical degree to confirm that everything was fine, which they reliably did. The prescriptions were real. The drugs were real. The consequences, decades later, were also very real, but by then the studio doctor had a very nice house in Pasadena, and everyone had agreed to remember the era fondly. The studio physician existed at the intersection of medicine and institutional interest, which is to say, he practiced medicine in an environment that had strong opinions about what the medical outcome should be. The outcome the studio required was functioning. The star needed to be on set, on time, delivering the performance at the technical standard required for production to proceed. Whether the star was sleeping, eating, experiencing something resembling psychological equilibrium, or maintaining a relationship with their own body that could reasonably be called healthy, these were secondary considerations. They mattered insofar as they affected the primary variable, which was production continuity. In this context, the doctor's role was essentially pharmaceutical management, keeping the machinery running through chemical intervention rather than addressing whatever was causing the machinery to fail. You weren't sleeping. Here was something to make you sleep. You weren't waking up in any functional sense. Here was something to clarify the morning. You were anxious before the scene. Here was something to take the edge off. You were too sedated to perform the scene convincingly. Here was something to sharpen the focus. Each intervention created a condition that required the next intervention, in a self-perpetuating pharmaceutical ecology that was, from the studio's perspective, producing the desired operational result. The specific doctors who served Hollywood studios in this era are known by name in certain historical accounts, and the names are not comforting. Several of them were associated with the deaths of major stars. Several of them continued practicing uninterrupted after those deaths. The investigations that followed the deaths were, in some cases, brief and unenthusiastic, conducted in an environment where the institutional interest of the studio, the professional interest of the physician, and the interest of law enforcement in avoiding the disruption of a major industry had a tendency to produce aligned conclusions. What is perhaps most historically significant is not the individual doctors, but the system that required them, a production model that treated human beings as assets with pharmaceutical management requirements, rather than as people with health needs. The doctors were a symptom of this system rather than its cause. Remove any individual doctor and the system would find another. The prescription pad was the tool, the institution was the design. You called him at whatever hour was required. He answered. The bag arrived, or the prescription was called in, or he came to the set if circumstances required it. He was discreet, which was the word everyone used, and which meant that what happened in the examining room stayed in the examining room, which served the studio's interest and your interest and the doctor's interest equally and simultaneously, which is how the arrangement had been designed to work. The car in Pasadena was very nice. You drove past it once, years later, and felt something that you didn't name. There was a precise moment in the career of many Hollywood stars, often arriving somewhere between age 30 and 35 for women, somewhat later for men, because the math of the studio system was never subtle about its preferences when the quality of the calls changed. They were still calls. People still wanted things from you, but the things they wanted were smaller, or stranger, or framed in ways that made it clear the negotiation had shifted. The big studios now wanted you for supporting roles. The smaller studios wanted you because your name still moved a certain number of tickets in certain markets. The television people wanted you, which in 1953 was still widely understood as a form of surrender. The transition happened in slow motion, which made it harder to name than if it had been sudden. There was no meeting, no announcement, no formal communication from the studio declaring that the era of your leading roles had entered its final chapter. There was simply a gradual recalibration of what was offered, and an equally gradual recognition on your part that what was being offered represented a specific kind of information about how your career was now understood by the people who controlled it. The scripts that arrived were still scripts, some of them were even good, but the parts were shorter, the billing lower, the enthusiasm of the pitch slightly more muted. The comeback was the response to this, and the 1950s had a specific relationship with the concept. The era produced several of the most discussed comeback attempts in Hollywood history. Joan Crawford's career resurgence after a long dormancy, Gloria Swanson's return in Sunset Boulevard, which was either a comeback or an extended meditation on what comebacks cost depending on how you read it. The comeback required two things simultaneously: enough residual cultural capital to make the attempt meaningful, and a vehicle substantial enough to demonstrate that what had been lost was still present. Finding both at the same time was a narrow window that not everyone could navigate. The practical experience of attempting a comeback was exhausting in ways that were different from the exhaustion of the height of a career. At the height, the exhaustion was the natural consequence of too much work. The comeback exhaustion was the exhaustion of effort in the context of uncertainty, of producing the same level of performance and professional engagement without the structural support of a major studio contract, without the makeup department and the studio doctor and the driver and all the machinery that had previously mediated between your actual capacities and what the job required. You were doing it yourself now, or with a smaller team, or with people who were enthusiastic but less resourced, and the gap between the presentation and the reality was something you were now responsible for bridging personally. Some came back successfully, some didn't. Some achieved something that was technically a comeback in the sense that they worked consistently and were visible and maintained a career, but that never quite recovered the altitude of the earlier era, which is its own specific experience, the experience of the professional who is still present and still working, and still excellent in ways that the industry has decided are no longer relevant at the scale it once decided they were. The phone rang differently. You could hear it. You picked it up anyway because you were a professional and because what else was there to do, and because the work itself, the actual work of being in front of the camera and doing the thing you were genuinely gifted at, remained the thing. Through all of it, through the contract disputes and the weigh-ins and the orange bottle and the premieres and the silence of the too big house, the thing that had made it worth any of it. You answered the call, you took the meeting, you read the script, you showed up. In the 1950s, the term nervous breakdown served as a catch-all medical category for a range of experiences that the era was not fully equipped to name, treat, or discuss openly. It covered everything from severe depression to acute anxiety, to psychotic episodes, to simple catastrophic exhaustion, all grouped together under a phrase that implied temporary malfunction rather than systemic failure. If a star had a nervous breakdown, it appeared in the columns as a health rest. If it happened on set, production was briefly suspended for scheduling reasons. If it required hospitalization, the hospitalization took place in a facility whose name was not mentioned, and the star was said to be visiting family, resting in Palm Springs, or taking some personal time that they entirely deserved. The facilities to which stars were sent during these episodes varied considerably. At the higher end were private sanitaria in the hills above Pasadena, or tucked into the desert above Palm Springs, places with pleasant grounds, discreet staff, and rates that reflected both the quality of the setting and the value of the confidentiality they provided. You rested. You reduced the pharmaceutical intake usually, or restructured it, or were given different pharmaceuticals to address the situation created by the previous ones, depending on the facility's orientation. You were away from the set. You were away from the schedule. For the first time in years, nothing was required of you except that you continue to exist, which was sometimes harder than it sounds. The public narrative ran parallel to the private reality in the way that all studio-managed narratives ran parallel to reality, close enough for plausibility, far enough for operational protection. Fans who had noticed an absence from the publicity circuit were given a version, The star had been working too hard, as stars often did, and had been ordered by her physician to take some time, and she was recovering beautifully, and production on the new film would begin on schedule. The coverage was generally sympathetic because the public genuinely loved these people, and the columnists, even Hedda, had an interest in maintaining the fiction of a world in which overwork was the only thing that brought stars low. What was not said was the pharmaceutical context, which was almost always a significant part of the situation. The withdrawal from barbiturate dependence was not comfortable. It was not, in many cases, something that could be managed with rest and orange juice in a pleasant facility above the desert. It required medical supervision and produced symptoms, tremors, sweating, confusion, in severe cases seizures, that bore very little resemblance to the graceful exhaustion that the press releases described. Stars who'd been receiving daily pharmaceutical support from studio doctors for years suddenly, without that support in a facility, were going through something that the era had no language for, because naming it accurately would have required naming the system that created it. The return from these episodes was its own performance. You came back to the lot looking rested, which you'd had time to become after however many weeks, and the makeup chair did its work and you hit the mark and delivered the line, and everyone agreed that you just needed a break, which was true in a limited sense and concealed the larger truth in ways that would take decades to begin to unpack. The industry produced these situations with the reliable regularity of a machine designed for the purpose, which in a sense it was, and it managed them with equal regularity, and it continued. By the early 1950s, psychoanalysis had arrived in Los Angeles with the force and enthusiasm of a very expensive new religion, and the movie community received it in precisely that spirit. Everyone who was anyone was seeing someone. The sessions were twice a week, or 3 times, or daily in extreme cases, and they were discussed at parties with a casual frankness that earlier generations had reserved for discussing the weather. Your analyst was a social credential. A famous analyst was a status symbol. The couch itself, the actual recumbent couch of Freudian tradition, appeared in so many living rooms of the Hollywood Hills that interior decorators began to stock them as standard items. And into this couch, night after night, weekend after weekend, poured the accumulated weight of performing being yourself for so long that you had genuinely begun to lose the thread. The analysts who served Hollywood in the 1950s were a specific professional cohort, many of them European émigrés who had fled to California during the war and found themselves practicing among the most psychologically turbulent population in American life. Their patients were people who performed emotion professionally, who had been trained by the studio system to produce specific affective states on command, and who in many cases had lost the ability to distinguish between the performed version of a feeling and the genuine article. This is a specific clinical situation that Freudian theory was, interestingly, better equipped to address than subsequent theoretical frameworks, because its emphasis on the gap between the presenting self and the underlying reality mapped rather neatly onto the Hollywood condition. What happened on the couch was, officially, entirely confidential. Psychoanalytic privilege was robust, at least in theory. In practice, the social density of the Hollywood community meant that the analyst who treated 3 of the 5 most significant stars at a major studio occupied a position of considerable informal influence, not because they shared information, necessarily, but because they were deeply embedded in the social fabric of a world where information and relationship were continuous with each other. The analyst attended the same parties. Their patients sometimes knew each other, sometimes were in relationships with each other, sometimes were in contractual conflict with each other. What emerged from the sessions when it worked was valuable in specific ways. The analyst was the one person in many of these lives who was professionally obligated to hear the actual content of the experience rather than the studio-approved version, who asked what the anxiety actually felt like, rather than what it was attributed to in the press release, who was interested in the real relationship to the mother or the father, rather than the one constructed by the publicity biography. For people who had been performing a version of themselves for years, this was either enormously therapeutic or enormously destabilizing, and sometimes sequentially both. The language of psychoanalysis infiltrated the social conversation. People talked about their complexes at dinner. They interpreted their dreams over lunch. They used words like transference and projection with a fluency that sometimes reflected genuine understanding and sometimes reflected the social currency of the vocabulary itself, the way that adopting the terminology of a prestigious practice functions as a marker of sophistication. This was not unique to Hollywood. It was the era's general relationship with the discipline. But in Hollywood it had a particular inflection, because the people using the language were professionally skilled at performing insight, which made it occasionally difficult to determine whether the insight was real. The couch was where you went to find out whether you still existed as a person beneath the performance. The answer was usually yes, though sometimes it took longer to reach than was comfortable. The sessions continued, the prescription continued, the car continued to arrive in the morning. The couch was the place where all of it could be set down temporarily in a room with someone who was paid to listen and obligated to silence. It helped and didn't help. The world went on. The 1950s were not a comfortable decade for having opinions, particularly if those opinions could be described by anyone with a sufficiently creative reading of events as sympathetic to left-wing causes. The House Un-American Activities Committee had been generating headlines since the late 1940s, and the entertainment industry, with its concentration of visible, opinionated, and politically engaged people, had become a particular focus of its attentions. Some of Hollywood's biggest names had files. Some had been named by colleagues who were themselves named by other colleagues, in a chain of accusation that demonstrated, above all else, how efficiently fear could replicate itself in a closed system. The Red Scare in Hollywood produced the blacklist, which was one of the more comprehensively devastating institutional mechanisms in American entertainment history. The Hollywood 10 were the most visible case, writers and directors who refused to cooperate with HUAC and were cited for contempt of Congress, sentenced to prison terms, and subsequently denied employment by every major studio in an agreement so uniform and so swiftly implemented that it raised significant antitrust questions that nobody pursued at the time. The studios had signed a statement at the Waldorf Astoria in 1947, the Waldorf Declaration, committing to not employing communists or suspected subversives. The Waldorf Declaration remains one of the more remarkable documents in American corporate history, a voluntary agreement among competitors to collectively dismiss employees based on their political beliefs, formalized in a Midtown hotel and issued to the press. The blacklist extended beyond the 10. It eventually encompassed hundreds of writers, directors, and actors whose names appeared on lists compiled by private organizations like the American Legion, or published in publications like Red Channels, a pamphlet produced in 1950 that listed 151 entertainment professionals and their alleged communist associations. The associations in many cases amounted to having signed a petition or attended a rally, or been present at a social event attended by someone who'd been named by someone who'd been motivated by something that had nothing to do with actual Communist Party membership. Your file, if you had one, and files were constructed for many people who would have been surprised to learn of their existence, might contain newspaper clippings, attendance records at political events, the fact that you had signed a letter protesting something in 1942, the fact that you knew someone who knew someone. The FBI under Hoover was genuinely interested in Hollywood, partly because of legitimate counterintelligence concerns, and partly because the visibility of the industry made its political associations useful for public persuasion, and partly because Hoover understood the symbolic value of the famous and collected information about them, with the focused enthusiasm of a man who understood leverage. Stars who were named often had to make choices of genuine moral complexity. Naming others, providing HUAC with names of people you'd known in political contexts, was the mechanism by which you cooperated and the mechanism by which you kept your career. People who named names did so for reasons that range from genuine political conversion to simple fear, to the coerced compliance of someone who'd been told the alternative was the destruction of everything they'd built. People who were named by these people lost work for years. Some left the country, some never recovered professionally. It was not a proud era for the industry. The industry has been inconsistently proud of this subsequently. In 1950, Billy Wilder released a film called Sunset Boulevard, and the Hollywood establishment's reaction to it ranged from uncomfortable recognition to outright fury, which told you everything you needed to know about how close to home it had landed. The film was about an aging silent film star who could not accept that her moment had passed, and it featured real former stars in supporting roles, playing versions of their own lost selves. Louis B. Mayer reportedly told Wilder he should be ashamed for biting the hand that fed him. Wilder reportedly was not particularly troubled by this. For the stars of the silent era, those who had been enormous and then been drowned out by the arrival of sound or age or changing taste, the film was either a mirror or a wound, sometimes both. The transition from silent film to sound in 1927 and 1928 was one of the most disruptive technological shifts in entertainment history, executed over roughly 2 years with a speed that left significant human wreckage in its wake. Some silent stars transitioned successfully. Their voices matched their images, or they adapted quickly, or they had the technical skills and the professional relationships to survive the change. Others did not. The problem was not always the voice itself, though voices did sometimes fail to match the expectations created by a face that had been projected 30 feet high for a decade. The problem was also timing and delivery, and the way that sound acting required a different relationship to the body and the space than silent acting had. Silent performance was physical and facial and large. Sound performance required stillness, precision, a different economy of gesture. The stars who didn't survive the transition didn't always disappear immediately. Some made the attempt, appeared in early sound films, were received with mixed results, retreated, tried again, retreated further. The trajectory was rarely sudden, and was usually managed by the studio in the same language of exhaustion and health and scheduling that managed all other difficult human situations. The star was taking time. The star was between projects. The star was developing something, and then, gradually, the star wasn't developing anything, and the calls had stopped, and the too big house was perhaps smaller now, and the fan mail had significantly decreased in volume. Norma Desmond, the character Gloria Swanson played in Sunset Boulevard, was a composite of recognizable realities, the enormous talent that had no outlet, the devotion of the few remaining people whose lives had been organized around the star's career, the inability to locate oneself in time. Swanson herself had been a major silent star and had navigated the sound transition with moderate success and considerable difficulty. She understood what she was playing. Her performance in the film, by universal consensus, is extraordinary. The work of someone who has access to the material at a cellular level, who is drawing not just on technique but on something personal and irreplaceable. For the stars of the 20s who were still alive and present in the 1950s Hollywood Swanson was depicting, the film was an unusual experience. It made their situation visible in the most public possible way, which was both vindicating and exposing. Their stories were being told. The telling was masterful. The person being told about was them. Swanson received an Academy Award nomination. The film is studied in film schools today as a masterwork of the medium. The reality it was depicting is studied somewhat less, and somewhat less comfortably. The hand that fed was in many cases a hand that eventually let go. The studio system built stars to specifications and managed them through their useful life and had no mechanism for what happened after. The house in the canyon was bought during the height, when the studio was providing the car and the doctor and the publicity apparatus. When the apparatus withdrew, the house remained, too big, and the person inside it navigated the distance between who they had been and who they now were with whatever resources they had, which were sometimes substantial and sometimes not. The film ran at theatres across the country. The famous opening line went, "I used to be big." "I am big," says Norma Desmond. "It's the pictures that got small." Being a parent in 1950s, Hollywood was a logistical and philosophical challenge that most childcare books had not yet addressed. The children of stars lived in the large houses, attended schools where everyone's parent was someone, arrived at studios on weekends where they were placed in a controlled environment while their parents performed, and were photographed at regular intervals for purposes of humanizing the family brand. The photographs were lovely. The children were dressed beautifully. The accompanying captions spoke warmly of domestic happiness, of a famous parent who was also, impressively, just a regular mom or dad once you got past the gates. What happened behind the gates was, in many cases, considerably more complicated. The studio had opinions about your children that were professional rather than personal. A child was a publicity asset, evidence of domesticity, of normalcy, of the kind of stable private life that offset whatever complexity was required to maintain the public career. A child who photographed well was more useful than a child who photographed less well, which is an observation that should never have needed to be made about an actual human being but was, functionally, the institutional calculus. The child was dressed by someone. The child was photographed in approved settings. The child appeared in fan magazine spreads with captions about your wonderful home life and the way the baby had your eyes and everything was absolutely fine. The actual parenting happened in the margins of everything else. You were at the studio from 5:30 in the morning until 7 or 8 in the evening on shooting days, which were most days, which meant that the early hours of your child's life were managed by the housekeeper or the nanny, the hired support staff of the too big house. You were present on weekends when there was no shoot, which was when the photographs were often taken, which meant that your documented relationship with your child was largely a series of posed weekend images that represented a version of parenthood experienced through a publicist's selection filter. The children, growing up in these environments, absorbed the particular lesson that their world taught, that visibility and performance were continuous, that the life lived and the life depicted were separate and simultaneous, that certain things about what was real were not discussed in certain settings. Some of them grew up to articulate this clearly, in memoirs and interviews conducted decades later, with a clarity that reflected both genuine processing and the specific talent for self-expression that tends to cluster in households where both parents work in the arts. Christina Crawford's memoir about Joan Crawford, whatever its contested accuracy on specific points, represents the most extreme expression of a broader pattern. The child's experience of a parent whose public image and private reality diverged significantly, and the disorientation of living in the gap between them. Joan Crawford's parenting has become the narrative of the Hollywood parent, partly because of the memoir and partly because Crawford herself was such an extreme expression of everything the era required, the construction of a persona so total and so maintained that the boundary between the person and the performance ceased to have a fixed location. Her children were part of the performance in the fan magazine sense. What that meant for the children's experience of being children is a separate question that the fan magazines were not designed to address. Most stories were less dramatic. Most were simply the ordinary experience of children whose parents worked demanding jobs with unusual hours and unusual social requirements, and who were doing their best with the resources and self-knowledge available to them, which in the context of the pharmaceutical and psychological landscape of 1950s, Hollywood was sometimes quite limited. The children turned out variously, some well, some not. Some who built their own complicated relationships to the industry they'd grown up adjacent to. The photographs remain. The children in them are old now, if they are still alive. The captions still say everything was fine. There is a reason that the most effective scenes in 1950s Hollywood films hit you somewhere specific, below the level of the dialogue, beneath the performance, in a place you can feel but not quite locate. That reason is the orchestra sitting just out of frame in a recording studio somewhere in Culver City or Burbank, performing the work of emotional scaffolding that the rest of the production was then built around. The composers of the era, Bernard Herrmann, Dmitri Tiomkin, Franz Waxman, Max Steiner, were working at a level of craft that would not be fully appreciated for decades, and they were doing it under conditions that would have driven a less obsessive person to a different profession entirely, which is to say, they were doing it under Hollywood conditions. The film score was written after the picture was edited. The composer received a cut of the film, watched it, timed it, and then had a number of weeks to produce a complete orchestral score for an entire feature. The number of weeks was always fewer than was strictly reasonable. The deadline was the deadline because production schedules had deadlines, and the production schedule's relationship to reasonableness was the same as the studio system's relationship to the well-being of everyone who worked within it. Abstractly acknowledged and operationally irrelevant. Herrmann worked with Hitchcock on a series of films beginning in the late 50s that represent perhaps the most discussed composer-director collaboration in film history. The Vertigo score, the Psycho score, these are works that have a relationship to the films they were written for that is closer to co-authorship than accompaniment. The shower scene in Psycho is terrifying partly because of Janet Leigh's performance, and partly because of the camera, and partly because of Herrmann's strings. And removing any one of those three elements produces something significantly less than what the combination achieves. Herrmann reportedly told Hitchcock that the shower scene was nothing without music, and offered to prove it, which he subsequently did by showing Hitchcock the scene in silence, and Hitchcock, who was not a man who easily conceded points to collaborators, conceded the point. The studio scoring process was industrial at the scale required by the volume of films being produced. Steiner scored hundreds of films over his career. The number is somewhere in the 300s, which required not artistic compromise exactly, but a kind of industrial fluency, the ability to produce effective, appropriate, technically accomplished music at a rate that continuous demand required. The orchestra was booked, the session was scheduled, the score was recorded, the film was delivered, the music was heard by tens of millions of people and attributed to the film, to the director, to the stars, rarely specifically to the person who had sat in a room with a score pad and 24 linear feet of footage, and built the emotional architecture of the experience from the ground up. The Academy recognized scores with their own award, which acknowledged the craft while simultaneously framing it as a service category, something that was done to a film rather than something that was part of what the film was made of. The distinction matters less to the audience watching than to the person doing the work, but it mattered to the people doing the work, who were producing extraordinary things that the industry's credit structure was not fully equipped to honour. The music played in the theatres. The audience felt it in the place below words. The credits rolled and the composer's name was there, in the correct size for its category, and the lights came up, and people filed out, and the music was already receding into the larger memory of the film as a whole, where it belonged and where it would stay, doing its work invisibly for the rest of time. By 1951, there were approximately 15 million television sets in American homes. By 1954, there were 32 million. The studios watched this number with the expression of people who have noticed a very large and unfamiliar animal in their yard and are still deciding whether it is a threat or an opportunity. It turned out, both. Television was drawing audiences away from theatres at a rate that made the accounting departments very quiet and serious. Stars who appeared on television were seen as having crossed a line, as having made a concession, as having agreed in some implicit way that the small box in the living room was an acceptable destination for a talent that had previously only existed at a scale that required a 40-foot screen. The studio logic against television was not entirely irrational in its internal terms. Part of what the studios sold was scarcity, the controlled visibility of a star whose image appeared only on the studio's terms, at times and in formats the studio controlled, which created a specific quality of cultural power that was related to the limitations on access. If you could see the star on television in your own living room, for free, in the middle of the week, the mythology of the star became harder to maintain. The movie star was partly a product of the distance between her and the audience. Television collapsed that distance in ways that the studio system was genuinely not wrong to identify as threatening. What happened in practice was a gradual erosion of the prohibition, as gradual erosions of prohibitions tend to proceed, individual exceptions that accumulated into a new norm. Stars who had passed the height of their theatrical careers began appearing on variety programs and anthology series, where the visibility was different and the fees were lower, but the work was steady. Directors who had been working in features began directing television episodes, where the budgets were smaller, but the volume of work was enormous, and the audience was increasingly actually larger than feature film audiences. Writers followed. The technology itself was improving. Early television was technically limited in ways that made it visually crude by feature film standards: low resolution, poor contrast, the flat lighting of early studio setups. By the mid-50s, the production quality of prestige television drama had improved significantly, and Playhouse 90 and similar anthology drama series were producing work of genuine quality that the industry could no longer dismiss as beneath the standard of feature production. Some of it was better than the feature films being made at the same studios in the same years. The major studios' response to the television threat included producing their own content for television, which required swallowing a considerable amount of institutional pride and developing theatrical presentation formats, widescreen processors like CinemaScope and VistaVision, three-dimensional film, stereophonic sound that offered audiences experiences the television set could not replicate. If the story and the star were now available in the living room, the studio would provide something the living room could not contain. The spectacle became the product rather than the supplement to it. Stars negotiated their television appearances carefully, or their studios negotiated them on their behalf. The first television appearance of a major film star was a media event of its own, discussed, analysed, evaluated as an indicator of career trajectory in ways that the appearance itself often did not merit on its own terms. The box in the living room had become the thing that defined the scale of everything around it. The theatres kept their seats, the audiences kept coming. But the 40-foot screen had competition now, and the competition was in everyone's living room, and it was free. There was rarely an announcement, no ceremony, no explicit acknowledgement that a particular film might be the last one, or that the era was ending, or that the person currently hitting their mark on stage 14 was doing so for possibly the last time before the phone got quieter and the offers got smaller and the whole bright, exhausting, consuming machinery of their career shifted gears in a direction they had not chosen. Sometimes they knew, at least suspected, in the way that people who have been paying close attention can feel a change in atmospheric pressure before anyone else has noticed the clouds. The last film often felt like the second to last film while it was happening, which was its own particular misery. Marilyn Monroe's last completed film was The Misfits, released in 1961, directed by John Huston and written by Arthur Miller, her husband at the time, who wrote the screenplay in part for her. The production was notoriously difficult, shot in the Nevada desert in brutal heat, with a lead actress whose pharmaceutical situation and psychological state were both in significant distress, whose marriage to Miller was ending in real time while they filmed the thing he'd written as a love letter to her capacity. She was late to set. She was hospitalized mid-production. She delivered a performance that critics recognized as extraordinary, the raw, undefended quality of someone who has stopped pretending to anything, and the film failed commercially, and the marriage ended, and within a year she was dead. Clark Gable died of a heart attack shortly after completing The Misfits. Montgomery Clift, who also appeared in the film, was in declining health and would die in 1966. The Misfits managed to be the last film of 3 of its principal cast members, which has given it a retrospective weight that exceeds its reception at the time, and that produces, when you watch it now, the specific sensation of seeing something that didn't know it was an ending. Most last films were not that. Most last films were ordinary productions that became last films for reasons of career trajectory rather than immediate tragedy. The role that didn't work, the film that underperformed, the period of difficulty from which the career didn't recover. The last film was often not recognised as such until afterward, which meant that the person making it had no access to whatever ceremony or intention might have attended the experience if it had been knowable. They showed up, they did the work, they went home. The phone rang less often after that. What the last film had, in the experience of those who made them, and who could retrospectively identify the moment, was a quality of ordinary professionalism that was either moving or unbearable depending on the angle. The crew was there, the lights were there, the mark was on the floor, the work was real work, technically demanding, requiring concentration and skill, and the performance of emotion in controlled conditions. The actor delivered. The scene was in the can. The director called wrap. The lights went down on stage 14 for possibly the last time for this particular person, and everyone went home for the day, and the stage was cleaned and prepared for the next production, and the world continued on schedule. The mark on the floor was still there the next morning. It wasn't for you anymore. The death certificates of certain Hollywood stars from the late 1940s through the 1960s share a recurring vocabulary: acute barbiturate poisoning, accidental overdose, heart failure in circumstances that were, as the phrase went, consistent with. The coroners were professional, the investigations were brief. The studios issued statements that were models of dignified brevity and careful vagueness. The fan magazines ran tributes that transformed the person into a legend with a speed that suggested the template had been kept ready. What was less frequently discussed in those immediate days was the supply chain, the doctors, the prescriptions, the years of pharmaceutical management that had preceded the final night, the system that had handed out the bottles and asked no questions and is not named on the death certificates. Marilyn Monroe died on the 4th of August 1962. She was 36. The official cause was acute barbiturate poisoning, ruled a probable suicide. The amount of pentobarbital found in her system was lethal. She'd been under the care of multiple physicians, including the controversial Ralph Greenson, whose therapeutic relationship with her had developed a dependency that numerous subsequent analyses have characterized as ethically problematic, in ways that go well beyond the normal complications of psychiatric care. She'd been receiving pharmaceutical prescriptions from several doctors simultaneously. She had been fired from a film mid-production. She'd been having a complicated year in ways that were simultaneously very public and very managed. The circumstances of her death have been analysed, disputed and theorised about for 60 years. There are people who believe she was murdered, for reasons ranging from her relationships with powerful men to intelligence community concerns about her associations. There are people who believe she died by her own hand, deliberately. There are people who believe the overdose was accidental, that she took what she thought was a safe amount of something she'd been taking for years in a body that had developed complicated tolerances, and the calculation was wrong. The plurality view among people who have studied the available evidence most carefully tends toward the accidental or at least ambiguous, but the evidence is genuinely incomplete, and the circumstances were genuinely strange, and the question has not been resolved. What is not disputed is the system that provided the conditions. The barbiturate dependency that characterized her final years was not self-constructed. It was built steadily and with institutional support over the course of a career managed by studios whose primary interest was production continuity, and by physicians whose practice was organized around that interest. The person who died in a Brentwood bedroom on a summer night in 1962 was not the same person who had arrived in Hollywood a decade and a half earlier, and the difference was partly the ordinary difference of time and experience, and partly the specific difference made by 15 years of pharmaceutical management by people who were paid to keep her functional rather than well. The other deaths fit similar patterns with individual variations. Judy Garland died of an accidental barbiturate overdose in 1969 in London at 47. She'd been dependent on prescription drugs since her early career at MGM, when the studio had begun medicating her as a teenager. The dependency had shaped the entire arc of her adult life. The missed performances, the hospitalizations, the comebacks, the declined health, the London cabaret run that was her last sustained professional engagement. The pills that killed her were prescribed. The prescription history traced back to a studio doctor in Culver City decades earlier. The death certificates are the endpoint of a document trail that begins in studio medical records. One follows from the other. The vocabulary of the death certificate was specific and clinical. The vocabulary of the studio records that preceded it was specific and operational. Between the two vocabularies was a person who'd been managed from one end of a career to the other, and who was not named on the prescription pad as a person. The tributes ran. The legend consolidated. The system continued. There is a specific alchemy that Hollywood performs on its dead, and it is one of the more remarkable things the industry has ever produced, which is saying something given the competition. A star who was, in the final years of their life, a source of institutional anxiety, too difficult, too unreliable, too visibly unhappy, too expensive to insure, undergoes, in death, a metamorphosis into pure symbol. The complicated person vanishes. The icon arrives. The films are re-released. The photographs are curated. The quotes are selected for maximum resonance. The biographies begin. And what emerges is something luminous and fixed and enormously profitable. A legend that the system that partly destroyed the person now claims as its own greatest achievement. Marilyn Monroe is the most extreme example of this mechanism, but not the only one. Within years of her death, her image, specifically the images produced by the studio machinery that managed her, the publicity photographs and the film stills and the famous Burt Stern last sitting photographs, taken weeks before her death, had become one of the most commercially reproduced images in American cultural history. Andy Warhol made her a monument in silkscreen. Her face appeared on merchandise of every variety and at every price point, in contexts ranging from serious art criticism to beach towels, which she might have found either gratifying or alienating, or both. The estate has earned hundreds of millions of dollars in licensing fees in the decades since her death. The studio that fired her in the final year of her life had no role in constructing this particular legacy, but the industry that produced her and the cultural machinery that had been built around her image certainly did. The curated legacy required selecting from the available material. The archive of a major Hollywood star of the era was extensive. Filmed performances, photographic sessions, recorded interviews, internal studio documents, medical records, correspondence, the accounts of people who knew her in various capacities. From this archive, the official legacy selected the luminous and the accessible and the quotable and the mythologically useful, and declined to foreground the pharmaceutical records, the studio medical files, the correspondence that documented the terms of the contract disputes, the accounts of the people who had been present during the difficult periods, and who knew what the difficult periods had actually consisted of. This was not a conspiracy. It was a cultural preference, the same preference that produces hagiographic biographies of complicated people in all fields, the same preference that causes institutions to celebrate their most famous products without extensive examination of the institutional conditions that shaped those products. It was also commercially motivated in ways that were straightforward. A luminous Marilyn Monroe sold more merchandise than a Marilyn Monroe accurately described as a person who had been damaged by an institution that valued her primarily as an asset. The result is a specific kind of immortality, enormous, visible, commercially robust, and built on a selection from the truth rather than the whole of it. The person has been simplified into the icon, the complicated human into the clean symbol, the history into the myth. What is lost in this process is precisely the information that would be most useful, not the glamour of the tragedy but the mechanism of it, the specific institutional and pharmaceutical and contractual machinery that produced the outcome, examined clearly enough to be changed. The star is immortal. The system that shaped the star is also still operating in modified forms in the same zip codes. The two facts are related. The legend tends to obscure the relationship. Not everyone who entered the system came out broken or left in the way the dark chapters of Hollywood history would suggest. Some survived. Some did more than survive. They adapted, negotiated, maintained something recognizable as themselves through the whole ordeal, and emerged on the other side of their careers with their faculties more or less intact, and a perspective on the business that was, not surprisingly, extremely clear-eyed. The strategies varied. Some built enough financial independence early enough to change the terms of their contracts. Some cultivated relationships with directors who protected them. Some left for Europe, where the studio system had less reach and the expectations were different. Some simply got out before the machine had finished with them. Audrey Hepburn's career trajectory offers one version of survival, a talent so specifically distinctive that the studios needed her more than she needed any particular studio, combined with a personal style so thoroughly integrated that it was impossible to disaggregate the person from the persona. She was Belgian-born, had survived German-occupied Holland during the war, and arrived in Hollywood with a self-possession that appears to have been impervious to institutional pressure in ways that the studios found baffling and eventually simply accommodated. She chose her projects carefully. She was selective in a way that would have been career-ending for someone with less leverage, and that in her case was simply how she worked. She maintained a private life that was genuinely private, in an era when most private lives were studio managed, which required both careful management and a quality of internal steadiness that the industry could not manufacture. Katharine Hepburn fought the studio system so consistently and over such a long period that her relationship to it became definitional. She's remembered partly for her talent and partly for the specific quality of professional combativeness that the talent gave her the standing to maintain. She was put on the list of box office poison by a theatre owners association in the late 30s, a collective dismissal from which she engineered a recovery through the careful selection of the Philadelphia story, which she had acquired the stage rights to specifically for use as a career restoration vehicle. This is a level of strategic foresight that most people in the industry were not in a position to exercise. She exercised it. She then did it again, more than once, over the course of a career that lasted nearly 60 years and maintained its quality throughout. The European option was real and was used. Several American stars found in European cinema and European social life a context in which they could work without the full weight of the studio apparatus, in which they were valued for their talent rather than managed as an asset, in which the social norms around artistic labour were different enough to permit different kinds of professional relationships. Ingrid Bergman's move to Italy, precipitated by her relationship with Roberto Rossellini, produced a Hollywood scandal that temporarily destroyed her American career and inadvertently freed her from the system that had managed her since her arrival in 1939. Her subsequent European films were among the most artistically significant of her career. The American career that resumed in the late 50s was on different terms. She was no longer under contract and approached projects as an independent, which gave her a quality of professional agency that her earlier work had not provided. What the survivors share, looking across the cases, is a quality that is easier to identify retrospectively than to prescribe. The ability to maintain a relationship with their own judgment about the work that was stronger than the institutional pressure to surrender that judgment. This is not a character trait equally distributed. It was easier to maintain if you had financial security and professional leverage, if you had particular personal histories that had prepared you for institutional resistance, if you had relationships outside the industry that provided a counterweight to its total claims on your identity. Some people had these things, many didn't. The ones who got out are not a redemptive narrative for the system. They are evidence that the system could be navigated successfully by people with specific resources and specific fortitudes, which implies that the people it destroyed were not destroyed by personal failure. They were destroyed by a system, with better odds of survival if you came in with assets the system could not easily strip. The distinction matters. It matters quite a lot. And so here we are, at the end of the day, your day, specifically the one you just survived, vicariously, in the back of a black car and a too bright makeup chair and a house that was always too big and too quiet once the sun went down. You made it through the orange bottles and the Monday weigh-ins, through the smile that went on at 5:30 in the morning and didn't come off until midnight, through the contract you couldn't read, and the doctor who didn't ask, and the columnist who was going to write whatever she was going to write, regardless of what you said or did or were. Think about that for a moment, in the soft dark where you're lying right now. These were real people who showed up, who hit the mark on the floor in the terrible heat of those studio lights, day after day, year after year, and produced something from whatever interior reserve they had left, some genuine, flickering, irreducible human truth, and put it on film, and 40 feet of it played in theatres across the country, for audiences who felt something watching it that they couldn't quite name, and carried home with them into their ordinary lives. They did that, on 4 hours of sleep, on a pharmaceutical rotation designed by an institution that needed them functional more than it needed them well. Under contracts they'd signed before they understood the language, in houses they'd bought at the height of things that didn't last. While performing, simultaneously, the publicly approved version of themselves for the columnists and the fan magazines and the photographers, waiting at every entrance and exit. They were not perfect. Some of them were difficult in ways that were genuinely difficult and not merely institutional reframing. Some of them made choices that hurt people around them, in the way that people who are not entirely well sometimes do. They were human, with all the ordinariness and all the occasional ugliness that human implies underneath the extraordinary surface. But the extraordinary surface was also real. That's the thing worth holding on to as you settle into the quiet now. The talent was real. The work was real. The laugh in the comedy and the grief in the drama and the physical precision of a performance delivered for the 30th take after a 15-hour day, these were real things produced by real people from something genuine inside them, and they're still doing their work on everyone who watches decades later, in ways the people who made them could not have predicted and do not need to be alive to experience. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, your ordinary, none-too-big, mercifully private bed, without a studio doctor's number on the nightstand and without a call time at 5:30, and without the particular loneliness of being known by millions and understood by almost none of them, maybe say something quiet in the direction of the people who lit up those 40-foot screens. Not for the legend, not for the icon that the industry constructed after the fact and has been selling ever since. For the person, the one in the makeup chair at 5 a.m, watching themselves be transformed in a mirror surrounded by light bulbs, becoming something luminous and fictional and entirely, specifically, exhaustingly human. They showed up every day. They did the work. And somewhere in the darkness of a theatre, on a Tuesday night in 1953, you felt something watching them. That was real too. Sleep now. You've earned it. They would have given a great deal for the same.